In the last section, we talked about the position of the striatum, which is one of the nuclei of the basal ganglia, and the relative positioning of the three parts of the striatum, the putamen, the caudate nucleus, and the nucleus accumbens, or ventral striatum. Now we'll introduce the relative position of another structure, the amygdala, coloured red in this illustration. It's down on the end of the striatum, and it's also adjacent to the cortex. In fact, as I mentioned earlier, neurons in some subnuclei of the amygdala are very similar to cortical neurons, while in other subnuclei of the amygdala they're similar to striatal neurons, and there have actually been arguments over whether the amygdala is really a single structure. But the overall pattern of connectivity within the amygdala and between the amygdala and other structures suggests that it is in fact one structure. So there's the striatum and the amygdala again. Now let's add in the hippocampus, which is partly separated from the amygdala by the end of a lower branch of the lateral ventricle. The anterior commissure is the axon bundle in white that, as I mentioned, connects the left and right cortices. And as I also mentioned, it carries axons from the amygdala and the hippocampus between the two hemispheres as well. The fornix is also shown. That's the axon bundle in white that travels over the top of the hippocampus under the ventricle where you can't see it. Then it curls over to reach some other structures that aren't illustrated in this picture. Now, as you can see, the hippocampus runs posterior to anterior, from more in the back of the brain towards the middle. And it's actually an extension of the cortex, but the cortex sheet thins down and curls in a spiral. Now in this movie we pull the hemispheres apart but show just the ventricles, the thalamus in purple, the hypothalamus in yellow. Then below, the cerebellum splits open to reveal the cerebellar nuclei inside. Remember that the cerebellum, like the cortex, is a layered sheet of neurons, heavily folded and wrapped around lots of white matter. And you can also see those thick bundles of axon white matter, the cerebral peduncles, that carry information from the cortex to the cerebellum. Let's have another look at the arrangement of the subcortical nuclei. Under the lateral ventricle, you can see the dorsal striatum in green, the ventral striatum, or nucleus accumbens, this time coloured in black, and remember that ventral means lower down once again, and dorsal means higher up. The amygdala is coloured in red, and the septal nuclei, which are part of the basal forebrain, are coloured yellow. Remove the other cortical hemisphere and explode out the nuclei. You begin to see the hippocampus in purple behind the amygdala, and finally, hidden behind the cerebellar peduncle, you can see a structure called the substantia nigra, also coloured black, which unusually happens to be its actual colour in the brain. Despite being lower down in the brain, the substantia nigra is regarded as part of the basal ganglia structure, along with the striatum, remember that's the caudate nucleus plus putamen, the nucleus accumbens, and some other structures. And one of those structures, the globus pallidus, which is illustrated in grey there, is nestled against the striatum, is also one of the basal ganglia structures. You can see again how the fornix axon bundle begins along the top of the hippocampus, and at that point it's actually called the fimbria. Then it curves up and over to end in the septal nuclei and the hypothalamus. The amygdala, cerebellum, and thalamus are also illustrated. Now let's have another look at how visual information gets to the brain. There's the main thalamus in purple, and the eyes at the front. The lateral genicular nucleus is coloured pale blue, although it really is just like in any other part of the thalamus. And you can see how the optic nerves from the two eyes cross over before they reach the thalamus. So left eye information initially goes to the right brain, and vice versa. The hypothalamus is also there, shown in yellow. Let's peel back the other cortical hemisphere, but leave the primary visual cortex at the back. Get rid of the cerebellum peduncles. Now rotate over a bit and you get a better view of the crossing of the two optic nerves under the hypothalamus. And you can see that visual information is getting to the cortex through the lateral geniculate nucleus. And from the LGN, the information goes through the white matter. So in a sense, we see with the back of our heads. I pointed out the globus pallidus a few moments ago. It's also an important part of the basal ganglia, and the claustrum is a bit in the way here. But when we rotate, we see the globus pallidus is nestled in under part of the striatum, which is coloured green, and right next to the thalamus. And there's a lot of connectivity from the striatum to the globus pallidus, and from the globus pallidus to the thalamus. So there's quite a few structures illustrated in this picture. There's the thalamus near the centre of the brain, the hypothalamus under the thalamus, the amygdala under and outward from the hypothalamus, which more technically we could describe as ventral, under, and lateral to, out from the hypothalamus. There's the striatum and the globus pallidus, both parts of the basal ganglia. The hippocampus is mostly cut away to avoid hiding the other structures, but there's a cross-section you can see in purple. And also the claustrum, the anterior commissure, and a few others. Here's another view which includes the striatum and the amygdala. Peel back some more of the cortex and you can again see how the amygdala is located at the end of the striatum. The putamen part of the striatum isn't illustrated, but will be lateral to the thalamus. In other words, on the side of the thalamus towards us in this picture, and of course hidden on the other side as well. Now, let's have a different view of the location of the hippocampus. Peel back the cortex again, and this time you can see how the hippocampus is tucked under the lower branch of the lateral ventricle. Also notice that the cerebellum peduncles close to the thalamus, in fact, there's a lot of communication from the cerebellum back to the thalamus. And in this view, you can also see the fornix from the hippocampus, travelling close under the ventricle and over the top of the thalamus for a lot of its path. So let's have another look at the hippocampus and fornix. The left cortical hemisphere has been removed except for the thalamus and hippocampus. The lateral ventricle has been removed from both hemispheres. But the red is a structure called the choroid plexus. It's attached to the ventricles and generates the cerebrospinal fluid, but we don't need to discuss it further. Take away most of the other hemisphere, then take away the left thalamus, and you can see the left and right hippocampi in purple, and the white fornix curling over the top. And at its end, the fornix branches, with two paths going anterior to the left and right septal nuclei in the basal forebrain, and two paths going posterior or backward to the left and right mammillary bodies in the hypothalamus. So there's very heavy communication from the hippocampus to these two structures, the septal nuclei and the mammillary bodies. The long indirect path followed by the fornix may be an accident of evolution. In some distant ancestral species, the hippocampus may have had a different relative location, and the path of the fornix shifted step by step as the position of the hippocampus changed. So let's look at the right hemisphere again from the same viewpoint. The limbic lobe of the cortex in this illustration is coloured green. It's actually a bit less folded than the rest of this inner face of the cortex, but the rest is actually part of the other lobes, just extended over the top. And as I mentioned earlier, the part of the limbic lobe at the bottom right, but partly hidden behind the brainstem, is called the parahippocampal gyrus. The edge of this parahippocampal gyrus is where the cortex thins down and becomes the hippocampus. And the parahippocampal gyrus is heavily interconnected with the hippocampus. And like the hippocampus, it plays an important role in memory. And again, as I mentioned earlier, the top part of the limbic lobe is called the cingulate cortex. And the cingulate cortex also plays a role in memory, but also in emotion. Here, the hippocampus is again illustrated in purple, and the septal nuclei in yellow, and the fornix connecting them is shown in white. The thalamus under the fornix is illustrated, and the hypothalamus to the ventral anterior of the thalamus, in other words, below and in front of the thalamus. But now remove everything except the hippocampus, the hypothalamus, and the septal nuclei, and you can see the fornix pathway, but this time with those two nuclei in place. Remember, the fornix is a nerve bundle that has as many axons as the optic nerve between the eyes and the brain. So clearly it's supporting a substantial communication need, and that need has a lot to do with the functioning of memory. Now this shows the right hemisphere plus the hippocampus, the septal nuclei, the amygdala, the thalamus and the hypothalamus, and the cerebellum from the left hemisphere. Removing the left hemisphere thalamus, cerebellum and brainstem, then rotating and pulling out the left hemisphere fornix pathway and associated anatomical structures, take away the right hemisphere thalamus, brainstem and cerebellum, and you can see the fornix pathway on both sides of the brain. In the foreground is the left hemisphere path between the hippocampus and the hypothalamus and the septal nuclei, but remember that along the top of the hippocampus, where axons are gradually added from different hippocampal regions, the axon bundle is called the fimbria. It's only called the fornix where it breaks away from the hippocampus. In the background, you can see the right hemisphere hippocampus nestled laterally to the right hemisphere parahippocampal gyrus. And again, remember that the cortex sheet thins down along the edge of the parahippocampal gyrus, curls over into a spiral, and this thinned down spiral is the hippocampus. Finally, let's have another look at the cerebellum. First, remove the cortical hemispheres, then split apart the cerebellum. You can see the heavily folded cerebellar cortex and the white matter inside, and the cerebellar nuclei. There are actually three different cerebellar nuclei. The dentate nucleus is much larger in humans than in other animals, and may be performing roles in speech and higher cognition. In the next couple of lectures, we'll get into some more detailed neuron physiology, and then after that, we'll return to the 8 major structures and go through their anatomy in more detail.